right, here we are, the after party, KUM News, D18. Some great candidates tonight. Let's get right to it and introduce our guest panelist. He's the campaign chairman for Congresswoman Madeline Berdallo, Mr. Cliff Guzman. Good evening.
Hey, half a day, half a day.
From the Independence Task Force, Victoria Lola Leon Guerrero.
Half a day.
And he's the Legislative Committee Chair.
Yeah.
Something like that. Bobby Shringi.
Something from the Guam Chamber of Commerce.
Right, there you go.
Half a day and good evening.
All right, so let's just get right into it. Amanda Blas, Lacia Casil, and Senator Joe San Augustine. Right off the bat, Cliff, I felt like Senator Joe San Augustine, we've had this where you have an incumbent come on with two people who are running, and you really kind of expect the incumbent to just go to town and to kind of own the show. But tonight, I thought that Senator San Augustine kind of played back a little bit.
Well, I think that happens a lot during campaignitis. You know, you want to appeal to everybody that you can. And by the same token, I think there's a certain amount of respect that a lot of the older candidates or the guys who are in try to give to the newbies coming in. But it's anybody's game right now. And so, yeah, he came across with some things, but I think he could have addressed some of the stuff that's happened already, some of the things a little clearer.
Right,
you know,
right. Especially with GMH and the hospital and the taxes. I mean, that's something that's like right in his wheelhouse.
Right, right. Particularly in taxes, yeah.
Education, he's the committee chair. Did he bring up education?
Not at all. And so, yeah, I mean, for something, that's the biggest department in our whole government. So, and they're struggling so much financially, and he's the chairperson of education. And this is his first time as a senator after running several times. So he really needs to be able to make himself sort of stand out and say, well, this is what I have done to try to assist with the schools. But not talking about it all, then it makes you kind of wonder, well, what did you do in your committee? You know, that's something he could have brought up in his introduction or in his exit, because I think for me that's a huge issue in this campaign, especially because I've got kids in schools and all I keep hearing is that, you know, GDOE has to cut. But we don't want to cut back on giving our kids a quality education.
Right,
so you'd expect more from the person who's chairing that committee in terms of, even if the question didn't come up, bring it up, you know, really place yourself, because if you had that committee, that's a committee that requires a lot of work and effort, and so I wanted to know more about that for sure.
Bobby, the taxes and what he said about taxes?
Well, I think for the most part, first of all, Senator San Augustine was the author of the original legislation that became public law, which eventually got repealed, which was the 2% sales tax. And I think what he did say was somewhat consistent with a lot of the concerns of the Guam Chamber of Commerce, right? Which obviously I think I can fairly say I represent in terms of the views on the issue. And what he basically symbolized was, sure, it was a real hard pill to swallow. I know a lot of businesses were just out there saying, what are you talking about, a 1% cut? But he did address the fact that it had to have been repealed. But there was one part of his response that really got me intrigued in, was the fact that he was the only one that sort of took a little bite out of something that a lot of people are talking about, a lot of businesses are talking about, that how are we going to address the collections aspect, and more importantly, how are we going to look at where to start cutting internally? Because, you know, we're hearing about, you know, the other two, and by the way, they spoke well, not taking away from them, but the fact that they're talking about raising revenues, what I think we really also have to listen to is where are we going to start cutting? And I think Senator San Augustine was sort of alluding to that. He didn't come out directly and said, he didn't come out directly to state it, but he was alluding in that direction that we have to start looking at cutting internally. It's a vague term, obviously. It's not something that, you know, and I think I was joking backstage while we were talking that if I was a candidate, I would basically come with my plan, present it, here Chris, here Bree, let's put this on your link, because it's a vague issue.
Right.
It's not something I'm going to be able to address in 30 seconds.
I think it's pretty simple, though, when you talk about streamlining the government. I mean, this is something that's been an issue in pretty much every election that I can remember, you know what I mean? And I mean, Cliff, you've been around the block. How do you address that? And I mean, people are thinking government employees, that's a huge voting block, and that's why they kind of dance around the issue of reducing the government and, you know, streamlining. How do you address that?
Well, I think, you know, it's so different today than it was, you know, I won't say how long ago I was involved in. But, you know, I think the issues today are tougher to deal with. because there's so much more to balance, there's so much more at risk, and it's not just about campaigning and saying being everybody's everything, but you also have to walk into it eyes wide open. Yes, there's the same issue there. You take people out, or you cut services, you cut people out of government, where do they go? They go to the food stamp lines, they go, and then what are we doing there? What are we doing for our society at that point? And it's a real tough thing to do. The private sector's not ready to take all those employees if we were gonna make the cuts that we think we need. And you can't do it in a fell swoop. We've tried doing it by the early outs. That was done during Gutierrez's time, it was done when Mark Forbes was in there. And that worked to a certain extent, but it was also expensive for the government.
And then a lot of those people ended up coming back.
And they all wound up coming back.
Yeah.
And so there might be a law. Maybe somebody should introduce a law. Hey, you're out, that's it.
And I think to add to what Cliff is saying, the other term is privatization. And whenever this term comes up, especially during election season, there's always a concern. People always generally assume privatization means X number of 100 employees are going to be out of a job. I actually sat on the GTA board that ended up privatizing a government entity into a private entity, and one of the rules, or one of the provisions rather in the package was you have to basically appeal to them. And when I remember one of the comments during the bidding process, one of the comments that came across between all the interested parties was that if we're going to purchase this 350 person operation, we need 350 individuals to run this operation, and these are probably the most qualified individuals that we're going to take. So I think if that portion of when you're talking about privatization, if you can emphasize that if I was running for office and there was a proposal, if I was in office rather, and there was a proposal on the table to privatize an entity, and I'm not advocating for privatizing any specific entity, but let's say ABC was on the board. A simple solution is as long as the employees are taken care of. Because economically speaking,
that's great to say. That's great to say. I started the GTA thing.
Yes, correct.
I was a chairman who started that whole thing. And it took a lot of work with the employees.
Correct.
But what do you do about, the government worker who's out there bush cutting? Because that's not a needed thing necessarily. You can have. There's lots of people who have bush cutters in the house that. They'll go out and do it because they need to work.
I think where the government messes up is those would be the people who would tend to get cut first.
Yeah, sure.
The guys who are out there on the front lines, rank and file employees, and maybe they should look.
And then it becomes the element of trust. Okay, let's privatize all of the collections management over revenue tax. Okay, now where does that go?
Correct.
Oh, that's scary, right?
Correct.
And so really you got to walk into that very carefully. It's not an overnight solution.
No.
There are no easy solutions. It's so much more complicated.
And when we're looking at the other question that came up with government corruption and a lot of the corruption that's happening with the whole process of awarding contracts and who gets what and how much money goes into it and who's eligible, and so there's been a lot of government corruption. That was a big issue that came up today. As you mentioned, it's something that people have been really bringing up a lot more than usual. And so it's how do we avoid that in this situation as well, right? And how do we, so if it's kind of I think the underlying theme in almost every question was this notion of let's really open up our government and examine it bit by bit. So we've got corruption, we've got to look at our expenditures, we've got to look at where we're getting revenue, and we've got to explore new alternatives, right? Somebody brought up casino gambling, somebody brought up fishing. So we can see there's a lot to do, but are these the candidates that are going to get it done? Did they?
And do we have the time to get it done? Given our economic situation,
do you have a plan in place? Do you have a timeline in place?
That's the hard part.
The sad thing for me, I went out over the weekend and I went and talked to different people in different villages, went to the flea market, went down to Boat Basin, and you're right, I mentioned before when we were watching D18 tonight, corruption was one of the main issues that people talked about, but then it was crime, it was drugs,
the hospital,
education, But then what was really sad is they were
Yeah.
saying, I don't even plan on voting because when I do vote or when I have voted, they forget about me.
Or nothing changes.
And nothing changes.
Yeah.
But so then it really becomes reinstilling in people a belief that we have a government that works for them, right? So I noticed that with Lacia, she was really talking about how her involvement in politics became through the Save Southern Guahan and like really trying to fight for Chamorro land rights, and then noticing the corruption within the Land Use Commission and how the community was so vocally against something, but they still gave the permit at first, right? And so for her, that compelled her to go into public service. And then, you know, that was something I had thought of instantly when the question came up about corruption, is like, well, how transparent are our leaders and how involved do we feel we can be in the process? So like, it's still a democracy, it should still be an open government. And so, but people have to believe in the government enough to even want to make the time to go and, you know, attend these meetings or speak at these public hearings and try to make a difference. Because if people are watching and these people want to get reelected, then it can really make a difference. But people just feel there's so much going on in terms of, like you said, like, I can barely pay my bills, you know, there are people in my family struggling with addiction, struggling with health issues. I can't even look to the government to answer these basic everyday problems, so I'm just going to disengage.
Yeah, it's just crazy because I feel like the scrutiny the public puts on these leaders, it's, you know, and just awareness with voters, even with non-voters, it's definitely increased. And I don't know if the quality of the candidates has also increased.
So
It just seems like no one is good enough for anybody anymore.
Social media doesn't help,
Everybody's
right?
afraid to run out. You know?
But you know, I think Lasia did really, really well tonight. I think she came across, you know, really relatable in terms of, I
She
come
did.
from a working class family,
Right.
you know, family
Very
of
articulate.
very
articulate.
family of fishermen.
Yeah.
So
How about Amanda Blas? Amanda Blas, I mean, very controversial. You know, was a executive director of the Commission on Decolonization. She could have been sheltered like a lot of her former coworkers up at Adelup. The governor could have made her whole and made her a special assistant. She chose to resign. You know what I mean? Which I felt was, you know, some people said it was, you know, too little, too late. But I mean, she told me, she said, yeah, she probably could have been able to stay on if they changed her position. But she wanted to run and give this thing a shot without anything hanging over her head. And you know, I felt that was noble. And tonight, I was really interested in watching and seeing what she had to say, because there's a lot of hype about her. I mean, people talk about, and Victoria, you know, Commission on Decolonization, people in the administration and even some people who aren't are really quick to give Amanda a lot of credit for how far the movement for decolonization has gotten.
Well, one thing that I noticed with Amanda, working so closely with her in the commission, she's very organized. So Amanda's the kind of was the kind of executive director that's, you know, she said she's going to do it, she did it. You know, she really fulfilled the role of the executive director, which a lot of times was a political appointment, and so that didn't always happen, right? So there was a there were decades of inactivity for the commission. So definitely in the 15 months that she said that she was there, she did work very hard. But I think that, you know, that's the interesting thing, is it's an executive director position, but it is still appointed by the governor. And so that's, and so now that she has vacated the position, we're all wondering who's going to fill the position. And it's an important position. And so it shouldn't be a political appointment. I think that was the issue. I think for someone to kind of step in at a time when really what we needed was organization and consistency, she lived up to that. But it, you know, her having to resign just highlighted that this is a commission that should, I mean, granted, the governor is the chairperson, but the position should really be filled by somebody who has expertise in decolonization, somebody who's really committed to it, somebody that really wants to take it to that next level. And she may not have come in with the expertise per se, but she definitely was willing to work to get it where it needed to be. And she came across that way tonight. You know, she definitely, when she answered questions, she's like, well, you know, she tried to give something that she could do, right? So the thing with technology, she was saying, like, this is something that I know if we were all on the same system and we weren't all having to try to figure out how to do things, we would save a lot of time.
Well, are you a PC or we're a Max over here?
I know. But no, I really think that her approach on technology is starting to go down the right road. I think all of them need to just learn how to articulate properly and pivot. So that doesn't matter what's thrown at you. If I'm for technology gets into everything. I can turn it into education, healthcare, stay on message. If you know our lands are important, you can stay on that message, and that goes in education, healthcare, goes to everything. You know, and it's the same thing with you know, Joe St. Augustine. He's got the message. He's been carrying the message. He's been doing a good job with the water, I have to say.
Yeah.
I mean, he takes risks when he needs to take risks, when he feels it's appropriate, whether or not it's campaign time or not.
Yeah.
And, you know, so I think there's a little bit, he's also the old school, where you give animus to whoever you're with, and you give them the opportunity to talk. So
Yeah.
you know, good on
30
him.
seconds is a challenge.
30 seconds
It is.
tough,
It's a
man.
challenge.
I wouldn't, you know, it's tough.
It's really tough. I mean,
Yeah.
But you know you're coming into this format. You got to
which is
prepare
exactly
for it.
what I was going to
Yeah.
get at. You know, typically you can come into this forum or any forum for that matter and say, okay, well, these are the 5 or 6 or 7 hot topic items that may pop up. Sure, this one's a little bit more unique because the questions are online and you can expect the unexpected. I mean, we saw that with the pay raise issue, right? That was unexpected.
yeah.
But the reality is, still, majority of the questions were related to issues that are hot topics that you can
Right.
expect. So if you, and Cliff hits it on the spot, go in, you got hit it on the spot, you know it's going to be a JMH issue, you have to be prepared for that answer. And even if, you know, 30 seconds is short, and yes, everyone gets nervous. I mean, I think, I know I'm definitely nervous sitting on the show right now, and the pressure's not on me. But the reality is you have that 5-10 second spot to say, this was a hot topic, this is what I prepped for, boom, and then you go into the rest of it.
You know one
And
thing.
he spoke to you. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead,
Sorry.
go ahead.
Yeah, he spoke to you about really looking at the expenses of GMH. So he said 2 things on GMH that I think spoke to you, and then the other to me, which was for me was like really looking at the compact, right? How do you that the compact impact funds are not being collected as they are being spent, and that, you know, how do you collect on all of these overdue bills? And so that's an issue everybody brings up, but it would be wonderful if there was a candidate that could really figure out, well, how can we hold the federal government's feet to the fire? And in your case, how can we as a government be realistic about, like, okay, look at every single line item and see, are we really needing this expense,
Yeah,
right?
go through a nice little, right?
And, you know, people
Break out your red
around
pen.
and-
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got 1,000 employees up at the GMH, you
Exactly.
know, so what?
Yeah.
What are they doing?
Exactly.
Yeah.
How can we better utilize them? How can we combine technology? How can we combine education and training into that? How can we kind of turn that wheel so they're all turning together?
Yeah. In fact, there was a discussion
And,
we had not too long ago. In fact, I had it with the Senator San Augustine, about looking at, say, the GMH employees and saying, okay, well, there may be 50 or 100 of them that might be considered non-critical positions.
Yeah.
And looking at them and saying, okay, well, what does the government need at this point? Well, definitely need new revenue agents. At DRT, need a revenue or regulatory individuals over at DM, at public health, as well as at DPW. These are revenue generating entities that can bring in more revenues. So maybe instead of looking at hiring another 50, 60 revenue agents and growing the government, let's look at a possible
Shuffling the
yeah, and this was a
deck a little
discussion
bit.
Excuse me.
during the chamber forum last week. Senator Frank Guggen actually brought that point up as well, sort of in that capacity. And looking into that, I mean, why hire another 50, 60 individuals when we have individuals that we can eventually transfer over, become revenue generating individuals, help eventually reduce GMH's expenditures
Right.
down the line.
That kind of sounds like what we've heard though before.
Yeah.
when
Yeah.
it's called,
Yeah.
But it was called reorganization.
Sure,
But
sure.
that never happened.
Yeah, and then
So-
look at some of the problems that reorganization causes, where you have, you know, and Senator Rodriguez brought this up at your chamber forum, where you want to turn 59 government agencies into 9
Yeah.
government agencies. Land management, Chamorro Land Trust, I mean, merging the Chamorro Land Trust and putting it under this umbrella created all kinds of problems for the Chamorro Land Trust. So I think we got to be really careful. And let's not forget that, you know, we want to keep throwing money at GMH, but there's also the issue, and people have been talking about this for years, of, you know, the quality of physicians that we get out here. You know what I mean? And I think some people have testified that there's a cartel of doctors that run GMH, and
Yeah.
you know, it's always
Yeah.
been the running joke that, you know, we get the reject doctors. And you know, I read the CMS report, and there was a lot of stuff in there that didn't necessarily have to do with funding. I mean, there was
Yeah.
stuff that did.
Sure.
But even providing incentives to, like, Guam, people who are from Guam, Chamorro
Right.
doctors, or just people that grew
Come
up in
back.
Guam, come back home and really give back to the
Yeah.
community and incentivize that, or incentivize it through paying for
Paying
their
their-
education and really appealing for them to come back.
Wasn't there legislation on that several years
There
ago?
There
was.
was,
There
But,
was.
you
yeah.
know, but it's been a combination of
Sure.
things, everything from malpractice insurance to
Yeah.
all of that
Correct.
stuff.
Right,
But
yeah.
you know, the reality is we don't have the the nexus to support a whole lot of specialists.
Yeah.
We don't have that many
Yeah.
people on Guam. And there's no next state that you can bring other patients in or go and visit.
Yeah.
So it's really, really tough. And we have to face that, at some point in our lives that we are still going to have to go off island for
Yeah.
certain specialties.
Yeah.
Let's accept it, and let's not bemoan the fact that we have to do
Yeah.
that.
Right.
And let's
Yeah.
figure out a way that'll work. Now, part of that solution was trying to set up the medical referral things, but then that got kind of tied up with the C word in some people, some people's perspective. So, the answers are all out there, and you can regurgitate them, or you can do something with them.
Sure.
And so
Yeah.
really what you need, there's plenty of great ideas. When I was a director of Bureau of Planning, there were no less than 36 different plans for education laying in the library at Bureau of Planning. And, all these economic development plans, beautiful, beautiful stuff. And none of it was ever implemented because the next administration came
Right.
in,
Right,
or
and
the
so that's
director
what-
came in.
Yeah.
happened.
That's
Yeah.
where the
We're
We're gonna
problems
have to
are.
pay for
And I think
another
that a lot of
study.
that
Exactly.
that stuff is has been crafted and created by some of the greatest political minds. that
Yes.
we've had.
Absolutely.
Who knew all the issues with the feds? Who knew
Right.
all the issues with the
That's probably what's lacking a lot
FAS?
nowadays. Is
Yeah.
Institutional
Yeah.
knowledge.
That historical,
Right, yeah.
institutional knowledge.
And
Because
it's
they were
that
part of
party
making that
politics
happen.
that stop it from happening. Because it's
Yeah.
like when you
Yeah.
have a new administration come in from a different party, then
Yeah.
like the Imagine Guam thing, it was like, oh, this is the first master plan. It's like, well, no, there was
not
Vision
really.
2020.
There was Vision
I
2020.
did that.
This is
Yeah.
our first master plan.
But yeah, it's kind of like nothing before kind of
Yeah.
matters, and that's not going to work either. In such a small community, like
No.
we can't
have
afford to play
share
like
and
that.
embrace. I mean, the whole Enough Malik thing really fits right there.
Yeah, yeah.
Bring your ideas to the table. Let's talk about it. Let's make it work together.
Going back to Senator Joseph Augustine, he didn't say much tonight, but I've interviewed him a bunch of times, and one of the things that I like about him is he's not scared to call out his colleagues. I mean,
Yeah.
No, what
And
you
I
see
think
is what
that's-
you get with
yeah.
him, which I like.
and that's one of the things I like about him too.
Definitely.
I don't know if it necessarily translates into bills passed, but I like that he can kind of be a maverick. I mean, I've
He's not
interviewed him,
afraid,
and
yeah.
he's called out fellow Democrats, he's
I mean,
called out Republicans, and
Yeah.
Who would expect during an election season somebody to introduce legislation to increase a tax?
Yeah.
right.
I mean, I give him that credit.
Yeah,
that
that is
was
bold.
to me it was the conviction. It
And
was his,
the-
and I commend him for that.
With the sales tax and going around and doing stories about this, when I interview people, a lot of people feel, and these are people I've talked to, I mean, these aren't like people on podiums or anything, but they feel like we're so behind in services that if people have to pay a 2% sales tax to, kind of keep things afloat, that most of the people I interviewed were okay with it.
Sure.
Because they
Yeah.
felt like
Which I think was
it kind of helps us know that we're putting in.
Which I
and-
think the resistance wasn't as strong back in March because you had the scenario, you had the fiscal crisis, and then
There's
all
all
of a
the
sudden
reasons.
it's
Yeah.
there, and then you start
Yeah.
seeing where the monies were going.
Yeah.
And I think that's where that sudden, resistance came across. To me, I mean, personally speaking, I think that if we didn't hear any of that, and we heard about GMH improving on this or this,
Yeah.
if we heard of the positives,
Right.
I don't think we would be talking about a repeal of the sales
Right.
tax, and I don't think we'll be talking about another, discussion on tax.
Or if
increases.
the spin would have been a little different, instead of saying like, yeah, we gave these raises and that's that, we're still in a crisis, maybe it makes them, concessions or, so maybe
Yeah.
walk back some things or maybe sacrifice some lambs.
But also, it's kind of
No,
again goes
yeah.
back to the issue of confidence, because if you believe that you paying extra taxes would equal better services or would equal better healthcare or better education, then you would look at Europe, right, where
Yeah.
they have universal healthcare, where they have free higher education. They pay really high taxes, but their quality of life
Yeah.
mirrors that, right? For a large part of the countries that do this. But here we don't yet we need to reinstill that faith in the government that the taxes will be spent appropriately, right? That they will go to the services that we really need them to go to.
Sounds like a slogan, restoring faith in
yeah.
Well, and
Where did I hear that
I
before?
think the underlying issue too is like
about the children.
save the children. But the underlying issue again becomes how do we begin to creatively, instead of looking elsewhere for solutions, it's how do we think of reframing our idea of governance, right? Do we just continue to fall into a system that really does give a lot of power to the executive branch and not the other branches, right? From the Organic Act, which was intended to give the federal government a lot of power. Or do we really look at it and say, okay, it's not working, right? This again becomes the reason for us to really think about, okay, how much can we actually do within our government, right? The
Is
Trump
this the part where you pitch independence?
pretty much.
But
But you know, we have to think outside of what's been given to us and create something better, right?
Okay,
The same.
but here's my issue, and I'm going to interrupt for a minute. It's
Yeah.
that to me, it's all about that. I have no issue with that, but I do have an issue that we are in a crisis. It's a crisis of faith. It's a crisis of trust. It's a crisis of leadership, you know, and it's a crisis. It's an economic crisis, you know. God help us if we have a major typhoon that comes through right now.
Yeah,
We're
for
so,
sure.
you know, and so
prepared.
we've really got to get a handle on that, and before we can start looking to other things, because I'm a great believer, let's stretch and go out as far as we can go, but let's figure out exactly where we are first.
Exactly.
You
So we
said
can
crisis
measure.
of leadership, and so when I look in the legislature and you see who's running, I think Mary Torres, she's one of the incumbents, Joseph August, but Mary would be, I guess, the senior
She would be.
incumbent,
Yes,
and she
yeah.
served what,
Well, technically,
2 or 3 terms?
Three
Senator
terms,
Barnes comes back,
yeah.
then we have
Right.
a little
Could be
bit
a
more.
tie.
terms.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But there's also
Yeah.
a
Lot of
whole
history,
lot of
yeah.
new candidates.
Very
and
new.
so, I mean, do you feel that that's the sentiment in the community, that they trust all these new people?
I think it's gonna. I
They're
think we're gonna
confident
dial
that-
it back. This.
I think it always gets dialed back, but I don't know that it's necessarily that they trust the people. It's that they may not necessarily trust who's there now, and they're looking and stretching, and then they'll go back and settle on what the defaults are,
Sure.
unfortunately. But I think I'm hoping that the electorate's getting smarter and smarter and smarter. I think just this past campaign season, looking at the type of people who say they're going to vote versus the ones who say, I mean, you got a millennial thing. Everybody's, oh, the millennials, go after the millennials. Well, millennials, 6% of the
Yeah.
vote
Yeah.
for the last 4 elections.
Yeah.
I wouldn't roll the dice on them, but at least they're starting to be heard,
Correct.
or they're starting to
They
discuss.
sure make a
or
lot of noise.
They're making noise. That's okay. You're making noise. Now we got okay.
Right,
You
yeah.
got our attention. What the heck do you want to say? Or what do you want to see?
But
But
if you
there
look
is.
at
Oh, sorry. Keep
if you look at the results from last election, the people who they voted in, they were like Selena Nelson. She has the Nelson name. So while they did gamble on some new candidates, you had Will Castro who run how many times, Joseph Augustine. People are like, oh hell, let's give him a shot, you know. So they gambled, but it was almost a safe gamble. And like I'm curious to see, like you said, this election. I
Well, this
mean,
one's a little bit different. This election is completely different because in 2016 you had the looming issue with the pay raises.
Right.
Regardless of what many will still disagree with, I still say it had some impact. This one is a little bit different because the last one you had incumbents who were impacted, and this one right here you have 8 vacant slots.
Yeah.
So you have what 6, 7? What is it? 3, 4, 7 incumbents or 6 incumbents, something like that. Or
Yeah,
what is it?
seven.
7
Yeah,
incumbents?
seven.
So you have 8 open slots. In order to, if you're disappointed with an incumbent, do you have 8 or 9 or 10 individuals that are ready to sweep right in and remove 1 or 2 of those incumbents? And that I think becomes a real issue here. And from the political perspective, a lot of these candidates just recently announced their candidacy. And what's the problem with them? The problem with that is you're now in a crowded field of individuals who are still at that introductory stage. They still need to reach out to the voters. And so you're kind of trapped in the position where unless you've announced, months ago and you got your name out there where now you can start talking about issues, you're at that point right now as a newcomer where you're still saying, hey, my name is Cliff, this is who I am, before I can get to this is what I want to do.
Exactly.
Because the reality is people still want to know who the candidates are. They want to relate to them. They want to understand them, on different perspectives.
I remember with guys like Ray Tenorio and when they were running for senator, I mean, the signs came out like almost a
Yes.
full year.
Oh,
Yeah, and they were everywhere.
I mean, and
your
that's
planning was a year
Yeah.
prior.
on point. And I think now, I don't know if it's these new people don't want to throw their hat out there too soon because then they're going to be subject to the scrutiny that comes along with it. So they kind of wait till the filing deadline or,
Sure.
you know what I mean? So
But it's like the Sonny Orsini. Remember when he ran?
Oh,
It
yeah.
was like every
Right.
5
Yeah.
feet
Yeah.
there
He
was
was out
a
there.
sign, and then he became the youngest
Right
elected.
there on Marine
Yeah.
Drive with his little sign on his.
Yeah.
But he definitely wasn't putting those signs up a month before the election.
No, they
No.
were out
Yeah.
forever.
Yeah.
But
I mean, they
but
were
at the
raising
same
money a
time,
year
like
prior.
a lot of these candidates, I don't know enough about what they've done prior, right? So
Yeah.
it's very hard to make a decision
Correct.
because you want some people with institutional knowledge that have worked within the government or worked within these different
Right.
areas that they're advocating for. But if your first sort of real job is
be a
running for
senator,
senator,
right.
then
That's
there's a
little
lot
scary,
more
yeah.
that we would want to know, like
Yeah.
what is your leadership skills? What are your organizational
Typically,
skills?
to add to that, sorry, real
No, go
quick.
ahead.
Typically, to add to that, traditionally, what are we used to when it comes to, especially with outgoing administrations? You're used to cabinet members who've had experience, name recognition, media exposure in the directorship positions that they had. Cliff, you were a classic example. You
Yeah.
ran in, what was that, 1998, correct?
Mm-hmm.
You had the exposure. We knew you as a member of the cabinet. So Cliff didn't have to go to the introductory stage. He got to the, this is what I want to do stage. This particular election, if you look at some of the members of the administration that are running, they're predominantly special assistants who don't get that regular exposure.
That's because I don't feel like any of the
as-
directors are good enough.
Well, they've been getting exposure. Chris has been giving them a lot of exposure.
But I mean,
Yeah.
you had a guy like, say, for example, a Nate
They might not
Denied,
agree with
or,
it.
Yeah.
a Nate Denied, or a Chuck.
No,
Adda, for
Bobby, you're right.
example.
I had this conversation the other night. Like, who are the directors that really stick out in the administration? And it was Nate Denied was one, and I know they're always
Chuck
asking him to
Adda's
run.
another one.
Chuck Adda, I mean, he's got the Adda name.
I think
so-
Len Leon Guerrero would have been another one he's getting. So these, if it would have been a different situation with the newer candidates. I mean, not taking away their potential or their I guess their experience or what they can bring to the table. They're at that introductory stage, and that's
Well,
really where we're at.
Yeah, and I think, the fear that I have is we all have these expectations because we've been around the block a few
Right.
times, right? The thing that scares me the most is I'm not hearing people asking, what are they about? That scares me.
Mm-hmm.
I go, and I get out a lot too, but I'm not hearing it when we talk about politics and people, hey, so who's this guy or what's this? I'm not hearing that.
Yeah.
And that's a little disturbing for me.
Yeah, I feel like in some ways it's harder to be an elected official in Guam, but in other ways it's easier to become one.
Yeah.
Because I
Don't
mean,
know
it's
about the
like
easy part.
the campaigns are so just surface. You know what I mean? Like look at
Yeah.
these senators running now. They're running like a month and a half campaign.
Yeah.
Whereas before, I mean, maybe we paid more attention before, but you're right. It was like a year out, sometimes 2 years.
The planning
Well,
is
it's also
not
the
easy.
economy. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
look at the gubernatorial camps. They're
Yeah.
holding off because they can't raise the funds either.
Yeah.
Absolute.
Especially on the Democrat side, because they don't know who to get them.
Yeah,
Like the
there's that.
donors, the people who want to give the money don't know who to give it to.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a
Well,
challenge.
It's a safe bet, right?
Yeah, it's a challenge.
One
It
in
is.
4.
And fundraising is not easy. I mean,
It's
and
not.
it gets even worse because
difficult.
now the pool gets so much larger that, and we're still dealing with the same, donor pool. There's only so many $20 happy hour fundraisers that any of us are going to go to, right?
I mean, I've seen all the
Those are
campaign
expensive.
finance.
Yeah.
And you have like
Yeah, the $10 ones.
people donate to vote. Have this some
Well,
people
yeah,
vote to
I mean,
Toriata, donate
yeah,
to like
the
Lord Gosh or
last
something.
couple of elections,
Yeah.
the people had a little more money. Businesses
Yeah,
had a little
sure.
bit more
Yeah.
more money to spread around, and that's okay. It's not they do that across the country.
Yeah.
But that kind of says a lot for where we're at today right now as well. And it makes you look too, okay, how many of these guys are really running and gals are really running to get out there and do something for Guam? Or do they just want the fame and the fortune that comes with it?
Not much of a
With the
fortune
title.
anymore.
Yeah.
Not much of
Yeah,
a fortune,
no,
and I don't know about the
exactly.
fame either.
Like, because we offer it for free. Like, hey, fill out our candidate profile
Yeah.
on our election website, and some of them just don't even respond to the email and don't take advantage of that because that helps us. When they come on D18 tonight,
Right.
Know
we
what
have a
they
little bit of
stand
background
for.
about.
And there's
who
only
you
been a
are,
couple
and-
who haven't responded.
No, there's
Right?
there's
Oh,
quite
there's
a
more.
few.
Oh.
Yeah, and we're already, like you said, a month out.
Yeah.
There are a bunch of issue-based candidates, though,
Correct.
Yeah.
like Lacia or Sabina Perez, Kelly,
Kelly,
and
right.
Mark
Pablo.
Tyson. Yeah, and they,
That's kind of a throwback. You know, like we
Yeah,
had those senators
definitely.
before who were like, this was their
Yeah,
issue.
the single
you know.
issue senators,
Yeah.
yeah.
And then they evolved, like Angel
Yeah.
Santos evolved into
Right.
just, you know,
Yeah.
so many different issues.
Yeah, you know, Judy Wampat was the education role,
Right.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And, you know, you
I
had
was
all
surprised
these
she didn't run.
Well,
Yeah.
We're trying to get her on the after party. Judy.
So of the three guests we had tonight, let's just go down the line and tell me what do you think their odds are of well, making a passive primary seems pretty easy, but you know, getting
Yeah,
a seat on
three.
35th.
All three make it.
Yeah, yeah, I think all three can make
Yeah.
it easily through the primary. I think the challenge comes in the general. That's going to be affected a lot by who wins the primary and the gubernatorial side as well,
Correct.
because that's going to shift the voters again, right? And so it'll be an interesting race to watch right after August 25th. I think that it's great to have focus on the campaigns that the things that you believe in. I think all three of them have an opportunity to do that. I think if they just kind of stay on their message, the way they're looking at it, you know, if it's environment, hold on environment. If it's, you know, lands, that's good.
Sure.
It's all good. Taxes, whatever. Just own it, deal with it, because everybody else is going to be out there scrambling. Oh, I'm for this, I'm for this, I'm for this, and I want
I
to do
haven't
this.
seen
and
an
I wanna do
environment
that, and
candidate
everything
really,
else.
so maybe
There haven't been many
Clint
issue
said
candidates.
he's for green.
Oh yeah,
yeah,
Clinton.
green.
Yeah, the green.
Yeah,
Green.
yeah, Green.
Well, that too.
There's a lot of that environment. Will Parkinson.
Right? Yeah.
And then Ned Pablo, I heard him the other night.
Right.
Interesting guy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Speaking in Chamorro, real
Yes.
tudding, real deep
Yeah.
Chamorro,
Yeah.
but really fired up internally about it, you know. He
Yeah.
really believes in what he's talking about, and, you know.
Maybe you need to throw a guy like that in there just to mess
Correct.
stuff up. You know what I mean?
Well, hey, you know, I mean, you know, I think that was one of the things I admired about Angel Santos. That was, he was in
And,
there,
that,
and
and
he was
Angel
going to
is
stir
Ned's
pots.
Nino.
Yeah,
Yeah.
correct.
Yeah,
So.
and I just think that was cool, and that's what made him great, in my view. I mean,
Yeah, I know
He's good.
Sabina's background, she's a science
Yes.
teacher, and she's done a lot of environmental work
Yes.
with water privatization and things like that.
Right.
She has
So
a
you've
good
got-
background in that stuff, yeah.
So there's a little bit of it, but
And
yeah.
that's what I worry is that with these surface campaigns, you get candidates who, I mean, and this isn't an endorsement, but candidates whose field of expertise and whose, you know, background and activism is kind of drowned out by a lot of these like fluff candidates who have big signs or who have the backers.
Yeah,
To, you
there's
know,
that,
that's
yeah.
always been an issue, though, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's always going to be like that.
But it
yeah.
also goes back to planning.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you just
Yeah.
have to, whether you're coming in with a huge financial contributor who's going to back you up, and you still announce in the same time as 20 other individuals, you're sort of riding the same boat.
Yeah, it's a kind of a level playing field from that
Yeah.
perspective.
Yeah. Like look at the case of Sabina, right? Where and Marsh, I feel like had they hooky backed on Protegi Letexen and you know the independence movement and how much buzz and you know word of mouth you guys have gotten over the last couple years and come out earlier. But I know their decision to run was more of like a, God, I can't take it anymore. I'm
I
gonna
gotta
run for
run. I
senator.
think they decided
Yeah.
a little
So
bit
they could have,
late.
you know, they could have like
Yeah.
Sure.
rode with you guys and
Yeah.
taken advantage of that. And then maybe that's on you guys next election to kind of, you know, bring some people.
Yeah, prep
that
them
you
about a
think-
year in
right,
advance
yeah.
and say, okay,
Yeah,
this is what you know.
but
this is
again, part of that too is you know with politics and with elections, you always have to be as appealing to as many
Sure.
different
Yeah,
perspectives as
definitely.
possible. That's tough. You know, it's tough. I mean, to run just on the Texan is difficult.
Yeah.
Because that's such a lot of different perspectives on that.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean right, wrong, or indifferent. It just means there's a lot of different perspectives.
But you could take
Yeah.
that issue and like you said earlier,
I'd
Connected
pivot on
to
it.
Pivot on it,
Yes,
everything.
you can
Yeah.
pivot on it.
it's
but
an
that's the
environmental
thing.
issue, it's a cultural issue, it's an economic
I don't-
issue.
Yeah,
Fortunately,
like tonight,
yeah.
I mean, you could look at, so the fishing issue, right?
Oh,
Like
yeah.
the fishing issue, the biggest stall in the fishing, native fishing rights rules and regs were that the AG said there's nowhere that defines us by law in the Organic Act as a native. Native Chamorros are not defined by law other than in the who can vote in the decolonization registry. So it just kind of halted. It didn't go anywhere. There was so much community dialogue and then it was done. So again, it's like looking at who defines us, Congress or us, right? And then there's an issue, right? So it's like, yes, there's a lot that needs to go into fishing, but there's a lot that's already been done. And what's our big obstacle? Again, defining who we are, creating a space for ourselves, looking at like healthcare. Healthcare came up so many times, and I know I said it backstage, but like it's not just about how do we get people to treat all of these non-communicable diseases. How do we actually really invest in preventing it, right? As a government,
It's about prevention.
yeah, and that they so much of what we're talking about too is that, again, like when people feel inspired, when they feel that they can count on their government, a lot of that begins individually, right? So how do you begin to reclaim your individual self, your health, your own everyday outlook, and then begin to, like, the more you're healthier, the more you're engaged, the better decisions you're going to be able to make. And granted, like, there's so many things that have contributed to, you know, our health the way it is, as you mentioned, like people being concerned about drug abuse or alcohol abuse or abuse in general. But like these are things that as a government, I feel like it's very difficult for the government to know how to respond to, so it's just so hands off. But if you actually saw a government like responding to these things, then they could have trickling effects into other areas of our lives.
War on ice, you know, and I'm sure there's federal funds, maybe we're just not chasing them down, but I think Guam is still behind the curve in terms of like my mom was in Minnesota and she was like, oh, if you buy a sugar drink there, it's like they tax you there.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
It's
there's
like
ways the government
So
could.
I'm pretty sure that wave, you know, whether some
Or in the
people
Philippines,
are
every time you
not,
try to buy a pack of cigarettes, it has a picture of someone dying of, you know, some illness.
the
It
black
makes you
lung,
think,
yeah.
And we're, you know, the World Health Organization declared a health crisis in the Pacific because Pacific Islands top the top 10 most obese places
So
in
you're
the world.
saying we're number one at something?
Hey,
We're number
top
one at
10.
something.
Boom, boom,
But
boom.
there
Give
are
them a
ways the
GDP
government
market.
could address it. Yeah. So, you know, just things that like we don't always think about, right?
Yeah, but you know, things like that, a lot of the programs are driven by administrations as well.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
so it's about the optics to a certain, you know,
Yeah.
let's face it, that's the truth. And
It's
so
public relations.
it's
and,
public relations.
Yeah, we
so
gotta
what
get out there
happens is
and put the
you miss
message out.
opportunities.
Yeah.
So where you might be able to spend 80% of the money that you get the grant, you wind up spending 40% of it because 60% goes to optics and
Correct.
you know,
Right,
dressing them up
right.
in the right uniform and
Yeah.
everything else and
Oh.
all that stuff, you know. How many cop cars can I blow the siren on? You
Yeah.
know? And so we just gotta, man, we gotta get out of that, you know. We gotta say, hey, the optics are you, the people.
You're the optics.
Yeah.
You're the optics. Yep.
Okay. Well, going back to your
Talk-
question on the three, Chris, the question you had earlier, before we kind of diverted.
Yeah.
Obviously, I think all three are pretty safe in terms of the primary election. I did say it earlier, I still feel that all the incumbents are still somewhat safe in this particular election. So that being Senator San Agustin, you know, not saying that he has an easy ride ahead of them, because nobody does.
No,
and
nobody
anything
does.
can happen in the world of politics. But as far as the two individuals, Lucia, I thought was very articulate. You know, I have met her a couple of times out there, and I see that in her, the passion's there. Amanda should have some finesse going into this because of the fact that she's run before. But really, for the two individuals, their opportunities are there. They just have to, you know, the hardest part for any of the new candidates at this point is sort of popping up in front of the others. How do you do that?
Yeah.
You know, that's the challenge right there. You know, whether it's an issue, whether it's going to be your marketing campaign, what you have to stand out because those 8 slots are going to be filled pretty quickly by newcomers. And the question is, there's 3 or 4 that are obviously, you know, pressing the envelope pretty high. Clint Rigel is getting a lot of good, you know, social media presence. Not to be biased, but I know Jim Moylan has the signs out there. He's out there. He's
They've
physically
been
out there.
yeah.
And
Early,
Amanda
they're out
Shelton,
early.
Yeah.
Amanda Shelton, she's out there. So these are individuals who obviously have name recognition already going for them, and soon they're all going to start talking about issues. We're starting to see crack into it. These other newcomers, they need to start separating themselves.
Yeah.
The biggest challenge, though, with what I would say for anybody who's running in association with the administration, the biggest challenge really is they're going to be cautious in what they say because it is, you know, that's just, it's guilt by association. Or I
Yeah,
would,
you know, and I feel like Amanda, if she resigned and she said she has no intention of going back to Adelup, I really feel like, and you know, hey, Julius did a good job when he came on in that he didn't really seem like an administration mouthpiece. He put a little
Correct.
space
Right, he
between
did.
himself and the administration. And
He did.
you know, I keep saying that's what I feel like the lieutenant governor's got to do too, is to put a little daylight
Exactly.
between.
Yeah.
They have
what's
to
going on
be
now, and they've got to kind of
individuals.
stand on their own,
They have
yeah.
to be their own individuals. It's okay to disagree on some issues.
Yes.
It's
Yeah.
okay.
And it's okay
Because
to
that's-
challenge
yeah.
the administration on
Yeah.
it. It's okay.
Yeah.
Because you're venturing into a position where you're trying to grow yourself into that position. You're not going to that position to be a mouthpiece for an administration, assuming that the lieutenant governor does advance in the general election.
Right.
That's what some of these newcomers have to do, and on both sides. I mean, it's really going to be a challenge of how they market themselves individually so they can break over that barrier.
Yep.
And there's a lot of ways of doing so,
Yeah.
and not everything requires spending $100,000.
Yeah.
Some of it's
Yeah.
just getting out there, taking advantage of these forums.
Yes.
And more importantly, when you're on the forum, own it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they were all very genuine, but yeah, there was, it's hard in 30 seconds, but there wasn't
Yeah.
much sort of that you
Hey,
could
Will
give,
Parkinson
deliver.
did it.
I was going to get to
Yeah,
that. Will
because-
Parkinson came here and he
Yeah,
owned it.
he
Yeah.
did, and they,
Let me
you
just
I
know,
thought
Free
Janae
advice.
Uggan came
Yeah.
here and owned it.
yeah, definitely, and you got to have tangible examples of something you're gonna do, right?
Yeah.
And
And
a
don't
lot
waffle on recreational weed. It's a done
Yeah.
No,
deal.
it's a bad word. Own it. Own it.
of,
Yeah.
yeah.
I feel like with Amanda, right? You know, she needs to slow it down, slow her delivery down. I feel like the stuff she was saying was good, but she was just saying it too fast. And you know, we always talk about this when you've been on. Are we looking for leaders? Yeah, of course. But realistically, we're looking for people who can work with people. And Amanda has worked with independents. She's worked with statehood. She's worked with free association. So maybe she needs to capitalize on being able to bring such differing viewpoints
Sure.
together and you know have a seat at the table and work. Lacia, she's really pounding that land. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
But-
and
I-
her grassroots
That's good.
background.
Yeah. I mean, it's
I mean, just
important.
keep
Yeah.
on,
It's
yeah.
important, man. And she's
Senator
got
St. Augustine.
opportunities. The whole
Yeah.
CLTC debacle.
Right.
Great
Yeah.
opportunities for her to.
Yeah.
She should tee off on that.
Yeah.
I mean, she's
Yeah.
doing
Exactly.
Heck yeah.
the Pago Bay thing, which
Pick
I mean,
one or two issues.
I mean, that ties
you're-
in the C word. It ties all of it in together, right?
And even that kind of level of commitment to an issue without
Yeah.
being paid, right? Like
Yeah.
this is something I'm going to do whether I'm in office or not.
Yeah.
I think she kind of brought that up a few times tonight to show that well, this is what I've been doing in the community. This
she
is,
definitely does her homework and
Yeah.
knows how to present it, and
Yeah.
you know, just us being behind the scenes people know. I know that she's going in and she's like pound that message home about that land. Keep
Correct.
land.
Okay, it's good. It's a good
It
thing.
is good.
I think Senator St. Augustine has still got another term in him. I
Yeah.
I
feel.
think he
Oh,
does.
yeah, I
think
do
He
too.
does.
People
I
like
think he
gave him a
does.
shot after he tried and failed so many
Yeah.
times, and
And he
I
did
mean, he's-
stand out.
Yeah,
I
he did,
think,
yeah.
He
and-
was a maverick. I mean, in election season, introduces something with dealing with tax increases. I mean,
Yeah.
I commend him for it. He did it for the right reasons, and
Yeah.
that's the whole. That's
Then
I
he
commend
believed
him
in
for
it,
that.
you know, because
Yeah.
I had to talk with him about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
I happen to be for 2%. I just am.
Hey, and
I
he's
agree,
got the
yeah.
motorcycle clubs.
Yeah,
many? He's at
Domino
5.
Lux,
Five.
and Masons,
Yeah.
and the Masons, and
I'm
Domino
like, what do all
Lux.
these motorcycle clubs think about you being in all motorcycle clubs? And how come you didn't come in the black
Yeah,
leathers
right,
or the
right.
black jeans?
Yeah.
And,
Well, we
Great.
certainly thank you guys for coming on. I want to
Thanks.
remind our voters when you do head to the polls on the primary election, do
don't
not
cross over.
cross over.
Don't
You
cross
either
over,
vote
Yeah.
all
please.
Democrat or all Republican.
Only cross over, you're voting for bad candidates.
And also for D18 tonight, this Wednesday, our guests are Franklin Meno, he's a Democrat.
Bunker.
Telo Taitagui,
Mm-hmm.
and
Stello.
Jose A. San Augustine.
Ah,
The other St.
okay,
Augustine.
the other
The
St.
other,
Augustine.
the other.
The other.
The
St.
other,
Augustine.
the other JSN.
Well, guys, it's been great.
Well, thanks.
Good talk, yeah.
Really,
Thank
really
you.
enjoyed
Thank
this.
you
Yeah,
so
we
A lot
hope to
of
have you back.
Yeah,
of fun,
I'd love
yeah.
to. Yeah, at some point, that'd be great.
All right, so on
What fun.
behalf of Bobby, Victoria, and Cliff, my co-host Sabrina Salas Matanani, my name is Chris Barnett. This has been the after party of KUAM News D18. Está Jos.
Está.